Hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about international conflicts. So we've learned a lot about military. Now we're going to see kind of how international conflicts can start. What are the different types of conflicts, crisis war, so some definitions and stuff like that, just so that you can kind of help on when you're looking at news or different events, studying different conflicts that occur, either for research papers or just for general interest. You can start kind of um, seeing what type of what type of conflict is this, categorize it, and if you're able to understand what type of to what category it belongs, hopefully you'll better be able to understand what you're witnessing. So we're going to start with kind of the definitions of conflict, crisis, and war. So we kind of get more and more, I guess, violent or as we move up. So conflict's kind of the most general. Then crisis is getting even more specific. So you can have a conflict without a crisis and war. You can have a crisis without a war, but you can't say, for example, have a crisis without a conflict, or you couldn't have a war without a conflict. So getting more and more kind of specific subdivisions. So start just in general, not even talking about international politics necessarily. Conflict is characterized by two or more parties engaged in mutually hostile actions and using coercion to injure or control their opponents, right? So two or more parties engage in mutually hostile actions. So this could be, this could be international politics, like two different states with each other. It could be two different groups within society. It could be you with people in your everyday life. You could have a conflictual relationship with a neighbor where you're engaged in mutually hostile action and using coercion to control your opponents. If you have, a dispute with a neighbor over fencing or noise or whatever it might be, right? That could constitute conflict, and we would use the same definition of conflict, whether this definition would apply for interstate conflicts all the way down to just regular old conflict with people in your everyday life. So that's kind of just the general definition. When it comes to making an international conflict, we just get more specific to interstates. So here we have international conflicts are the segment of conflicts that relate to disputes among independent members of the global system. So to be a participant in an international conflict, you have to be an independent member of the global system. Comprises the widest set of our widest possible range of hostile behaviors, from physical and verbal threats through diplomatic, political, and or economic boycott, to psychological warfare and violence, and whether it could be minor incidents, serious clashes, or full-scale war, right? So wars, full-scale wars with violence would be instances of conflict, right? But it could even be instances or disputes that lead to just physical or verbal threats, diplomatic boycotts. There's a whole range of different policies that can emerge from international conflict, war being only one of many. But it'd be cases where you have dispute among independent members of the state where there's some form of coercion or attempt to control the behavior of the other side, right? So there has to be some form of disagreement, some form of dispute that leads to hostile behavior and some form of coercion. But as to whether, so in the international system, if you look around, there's many, many, many instances of conflict. There's relatively few instances of crisis and even fewer instances of war. So most conflicts, most of the time, don't escalate up to war. International crises is a subset of conflict where there's a change in the type and or increase in the intensity of a disruptive interaction between two or more states. So something has changed where the conflict, there's been a change in either the type or the intensity of the conflict. So the hostile actions between the two, so there was hostile actions already because there was a conflict before, but either there's been a change in type or it's become more intense between two or more states with a heightened probability of military hostilities, right? So it could be there was low-level military kind of actions, say preparations in the conflict, but that's changed in intensity. Or it could have been where before it was economic boycott, but now it's military boycott. Or before it was, all peaceful diplomatic exchanges. Now there's militarization going on. And so where there's a heightened probability of military hostilities, then in turn destabilizes the relationship and challenges the structure of the international system, right? So there's a heightened probability of war, and this can destabilize certainly the relationship of the two, but could also have spillover effects into the wider international system, right? So something triggers, for a crisis to occur, something triggers what was a conflict, because conflicts can last for a very long time. Like I said, very few of them go up to war, but there's been something that has led to a change in it, in how the conflict is being managed, in terms of how it's being handled, where there's now felt to be a higher probability of military hostilities in the near future. But what can trigger this kind of this development, this change in type or increase in intensity of disruptive interactions? What can lead to this, where we go from just a conflict into this crisis mode? Well, one of the different parties, one of the different states involved, has to start by viewing a crisis. So we would refer to this as a foreign policy crisis. So for there to be an international crisis, at least one of the different sides have to perceive a foreign policy crisis. So they have to perceive a change in type of disruptive interactions, or an increase in intensity of disruptive interactions between the states. So they have to perceive it. So foreign policy crisis, the trigger to a foreign policy crisis is perceptual. So like I said, one of the different sides involved have to perceive a change in disruptive interactions. And that is, it derives from three interrelated perceptions that are generated by a hostile act, disruptive event, or environmental change, right? So something that they see in terms of this conflict, they get a greater perception of increasing likelihood of conflict, and these come from either a hostile act. So there could be a conflict and the other side does something hostile as part of the conflict, because there's hostile acts in the conflict, but they take a certain hostile act that generates a crisis, a greater perception of a heightened probability of war, or it could be some disruptive event or environmental change. So any of these. So what are these different perceptions that are required? So it says derived from three interrelated perceptions. So what are the perceptions that are required to generate a foreign policy crisis? Well, first, that we've got a higher than normal threat to one or more basic values, right? So this hostile act has to constitute a higher than normal threat to one or more basic values, right? So it can't just be threatening any old value, right? It has to be something that's of core interest to the state, or it can't easily give concessions on it because it's such important interest. So something like national security, or some vital interest, some vital resource required for the state. If it's too peripheral of an interest, then the state is probably not willing to go to war. It may be willing to have a conflict over it, but it's not willing to risk war over it. In this case, you wouldn't see a foreign policy crisis. Finite time for response. So there's got to be the pressure that this isn't just, in 5 years from now, we might have war. But this hostility has created a sense in them where they feel like the hostility has gotten sufficiently high that whatever's coming next requires a response very, very soon. And heightened probability of involvement in military hostilities, war, before the threat is overcome. So it's got to be a heightened probability that based on this disruptive event, there's a clear threat to something important that's hard to compromise on. There's a finite time period with which to respond to kind of this new phase, this new hostile act. And there's a heightened probability that in this new level of interactions, that you'll end up in military hostilities, particularly war, before it's overcome. So if one state perceives these, then you've entered into foreign policy crisis. And then if both states kind of enter into the same, say, first state's response to it then provokes a foreign policy crisis in the other state, then you end up in an international crisis where we have a heightened probability of war in general through changes in the type or intensity of conflictual behavior between the two different states. So think about, for example, a great example, we could take the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So there've been already at that point for, almost 20 years, there's been some level of conflict, at least 15 years, there's been some level of conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. And there's always the general level threat that it could escalate the war, but most of the behaviors at that time, were managed through a variety of different means. So escalation into war hadn't been one of them. There'd been economic and diplomatic and psychological different ways of dealing with it. Certain military short of war, sometimes, blockades, whatnot. But when the Cuban Missile Crisis arose, and the Soviets placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, this generated a foreign policy crisis for the U.S. Right, this change in type or of behaviors of hostile acts by the Soviet Union, placing nuclear weapons so close to the U.S. homeland, right, generated higher than normal threat to one or more basic values. Right, so the security of the U.S. homeland was at stake. Finite time for response, right? So there's a perception the US needed to come up with its response before the weapons became active, right? Because afterwards it would lose some level of control. And heightened probability of involvement in military hostilities, right? There weren't many options, diplomatic options perceived for being able to remove those weapons. So there was a heightened probability of having to at minimum fight Cuban forces to get rid of them, possibly requiring an invasion, but also knowing that there were some Soviet troops on the ground. So the risk that this could escalate beyond just fighting against Cuba. So in this case, this generated a foreign policy crisis. The heightened alert, US going on heightened military alert, activating military troops, going on to war, more of a war footing, then would generate a foreign policy crisis for the Soviet Union. Seeing the US response, seeing that the US is changing its type of behavior, but also intensity of behavior, would generate a foreign policy crisis for the Soviet Union, and therefore an international crisis more broadly. And then finally, war. So according to the Correlates of War project, which is a project that kind of quantifies all different wars. So it takes all the different wars and looks at a whole bunch of different variables associated with the war to try to come up with kind of what are the different factors associated with war. So there's a variety of different definitions of war, but in international politics, this is one of the most commonly used one. So a war involves following three characteristics. So sustained combat or violence, right? So it can't just be like one instance of violence, but there's got to be sustained combat. It involves organized forces on both sides. So if it's just one set of, one army attacking just a group of civilians and massacring a bunch of civilians, that's not a war, right? Because you don't have organized armed forces on both sides. Now, the armed forces don't necessarily have to be government forces on both sides. That depends on your type of war, but there has to be some form of organized armed forces on both sides, and results in a minimum of 1,000 battle-related deaths in a 12-month period. So this is to a certain extent the first two are easy enough to wrap your mind around. The final one is a little bit subjective. The idea here is the 12-month period, so it has to be sustained to a certain extent. And also to making sure, like say there's 1,000 battle deaths, but over 20 years, that's not many per year. So in a year, there's got to have been kind of 1,000 battle deaths. And the 1,000 is to try to set it, we're not just talking a small skirmish, like there's a skirmish, even if it's a sustained skirmish and, 10 people die on both sides. I mean, yes, there's violence, but is that really a war? So it's to try to keep the military hostilities that are small enough to try to keep them out, because otherwise if war becomes every instance of military hostility, including, one soldier gets scared and fires across the border and injures somebody on the other side or kills somebody on the other side, but it wasn't ordered by anyone, that starts becoming, then we're stretching the concept of war beyond its usefulness. Now, is there a major difference between something that has 900 battle deaths and 1,000 battle deaths? Where should the threshold be for this 1,000? It's somewhat arbitrary. A lot of these models would probably test and see, based on predictions about like the causes of war, is there a major sensitivity to whether we put 1,000 battle deaths or slightly more, slightly less? And most would probably find no. But there is an element of arbitrariness here. So what are the types of war? So interstate war, this is what we think normally when we talk about war. So this is one or two or more states engaging in war with each other, so fighting each other. So think of World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, Iraq War. You've got multiple different governments fighting each other. And so that's often when we say the term war, particularly if we just say war, oftentimes people will be thinking of interstate war, but it's not the only type of war. Extrastate wars are wars between a state and a non-state actor outside of the boundaries of the state. So imagine a situation where the US starts fighting a non-state group in Mexico. Now, as long as there's sustained violence, there's sustained violence, organized members on each side, and a sufficient quantity of death, right? That would meet the definition for a war. So, for example, it could even be if the US is fighting drug cartels in Mexico or in Colombia, that could qualify as an extrastate war. It's not being fought on the territory of the United States. So it's not an internal war, so it's extra-state. And it's not being fought against another government. You're not fighting government troops from the other side, so it's not an interstate war. The third, interstate wars, which we'll talk more about in a future lecture, but just kind of briefly for introduction. Interstate wars are wars that mainly take place within the recognized territory of a state. So it's wars that happen within the boundaries of a state. It could spill over sometimes into other states, but the primary feature for an interstate war is it happens all within kind of one state. And so there's a few different variants. The ones that you'll be most used to are civil wars. And so civil wars are wars between central government and a non-state actor, one or more non-state actors, right? So you've got, the government is fighting against some rebel group that has, and we'll talk more about the different purposes of rebel groups, that it may be for trying to overthrow the government. It may be for regional autonomy for a particular region. It could be for secession, so complete autonomy for a region, but it's the central government fighting against some non-state actor. We then have regional internal wars. So these are similar to civil wars, but they're within a particular region of the state. So they'd be wars between regional government and non-state actors. So if, for example, the Quebec government were to go fight against, some group, some non-state actor within Quebec, right? So the Canadian government's not involved itself. The wars between the Quebec government and that non-state actor. That would be characterized as a regional internal war. And then finally, intercommunal wars are wars between two or more non-state actors within the state. So if you think about in Syria, where you had some of the some of the non-state actors, right? So you had ISIS were fighting against some of, say, the US allied rebel groups, right? And so in that case, now you also had them fighting, both of them fighting the central government, making it a mess that we'll talk about later. But the portion of that war where we're seeing ISIS fighting against different rebel groups who aren't the government, that would be an intercommunal war, or would have an element of an intercommunal war there. So the government's not necessarily involved at all in intercommunal wars. And then finally, we have non-state wars. And these are wars between or among non-state entities. So it could be wars that take place outside of the territories of members of interstate system. So it could be if a war were to happen, say, in any territory that's not controlled by a nation state, I suppose. So it could happen within international waters, but also it could happen, say, within, probably the more common would be, it happens within a failed state. So a state is completely collapsed, no government has sovereignty over the state, and then you have multiple actors fighting over the territory. That could be a non-state war. This would be more rare, and then wars between non-state actors that cross state borders. So this could be a little bit more common, where, say, you've got a rebel group or a non-state actor in one country fighting a non-state actor from the other country. But so it's not an intercommunal war because it's not within one state, but it's a non-state war because they're fighting across different states. So if you have two different non-state groups or two different rebel groups, if they're fighting within one state, it would be a type of interstate war. If they're fighting across state lines, across state borders, those would be non-state wars. That would be a little bit more common than the first one, but non-state wars still would be interstate wars, and particularly intrastate wars are would be much more common. So now that we've talked about types of different wars, we could talk about wars also in terms of their size. So the largest size wars would be what we refer to as hegemonic wars, but they're also known as world wars, which is probably the term that you're most familiar with: global war, general war, or systemic war. So hegemonic wars are wars for control of the entire world order. The rules of the international system as a whole are at stake, right? So whoever wins the war will be able to, because it's between the largest powers in the world, whoever wins the hegemonic war, whoever wins the world war, will kind of be able to set the rules of the game for the wider international system. So think about World War II. If the Allies had won versus if the Axis powers had won. When the Allies won, the Soviet Union was able to kind of set the rules of the game in their sphere, and the United States, slightly globally, but also slightly kind of within their sphere, was able to set the rules of the game. You could think that these institutions, say, that the US had created, the UN, the different economic institutions, the liberal economic order, all of that stuff. You imagine if Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had won. Do you think that they would have created the same rules of the game, the same types of institutions? Probably not. So that's what we're talking about at stake in hegemonic wars, in global wars, and world wars. Total wars, a step down, is warfare by one state waged to conquer and occupy another. There could be more than two states involved. Modern total wars originated in Napoleonic Wars, which relied on conscription on a mass scale. So before the Napoleonic Wars, wars were certainly fought, but they weren't like the entire mobilization of a country against the entire mobilization of a different country. It tended to be, kind of the warrior class within both, knights from both sides, limited scale, fought battles against each other, and whoever won that, won the war. Starting in the Napoleonic War, wars in terms of how much they affected the wider society, how much wider society became involved in the conflict, expanded massively in the Napoleonic Wars, and has continued since, where it's not just a small warrior class, but wider conscription of massive size armies, requiring massive size economic support from the wider community in terms of food for being able to fight, in terms of armaments, in terms of logistical support. So the entire country goes onto a war footing in a total war. So in many ways, the world wars would be examples of total wars. The difference between that is, so world wars would be total wars, but not all total wars are world wars, right? You could have two small states that engage in total war, and these are not for the control of the international system, but all it requires to reach total war is a complete mobilization of military force, of resources within both countries, and the goal is to completely conquer and occupy another state. And then finally, at a level below that is limited war. So military actions that seek objectives short of the surrender and occupation of the enemy. So in total wars, you're usually trying to take over and you're mobilizing on a massive scale to take over the entirety of and occupy the entirety of the other territory of another state. In a limited war, it fought for smaller purposes, right? So it could be you're fighting a war over natural resources in a particular region. It could be you're trying to rescue a population group that you view as your own in a particular region. So you're trying to just occupy or take over a particular region. It could be just conflict, not over necessarily trying to take territory, but trying to get the other state to make concessions on some other issue. So the goal is less than, they could still be very, very important goals, but it's less than the complete surrender and occupation of the other side. They're more limited aims, where total war has complete aims of taking over and occupying the entire country. Then we should also bring up irregular warfare as kind of a type of warfare. And here we would have the example of guerrilla warfare. So guerrilla warfare is warfare without front lines and with irregular forces operating in the midst of and often hidden or protected by civilian population, right? So this is a war without front lines. So think about often your wars when you have between conventional forces, you kind of have a line of control. It doesn't have to be a straight line, but you've got a line of control where on one side of this line, one side controls the territory, and on the other side of the line, the other side controls the territories, and many of the military resources of both are stationed along the line, and you're continually trying, both sides are continually trying to push the line so that they control more territory. That's kind of your typical version of conventional warfare. In guerrilla warfare, there's not necessarily front lines, right? So it may be that one side controls, a whole lot of territory, but within there, there's pockets of troops from the other side that keep on engaging in military actions against the other side, right? So they may, they're hidden, they pop out, launch an attack on the forces of the other side, and then return to hiding. It could be that they've got, a cave network or tunnels that they can hide in. It could be that when they do their attacks, they don't wear regular military uniforms, and so they come out, attack, and then they return to the village, and they're indistinguishable from members of the village. So either you've so if the village is sympathetic with them and aren't willing to cooperate and point out who they are, unless you can find their weaponry or catch them in the act, it's impossible to know who's just a regular civilian and who's a member of the guerrilla forces. This is something that's most commonly we see in like interstate war, a tactic used by many non-state actors who don't have the size or resources to engage in a normal conventional war with the government. There are some very strong guerrilla groups who may be able to do some form of conventional warfare, but a lot of non-state actors have to rely on guerrilla warfare. It could be things, there's an element of guerrilla warfare in the Vietnam War used by the Vietnamese against the US. The US was stronger, so if it was to be fought in a regular conventional warfare, the US would be sure to be successful. But by being able to hide and launch guerrilla attacks against American forces and then being able to go back and hide where it was tougher to find them, while they could never conventionally, say, defeat the US, they could keep on making the US bleed, keep on inflicting casualties and more casualties and more casualties and more casualties on the US with the hope that eventually they would withdraw. So what are the causes of war? So we could do an entire course. I mean, at universities, there are entire courses on causes of war. So we'll keep it relatively simple here, but just at the different levels of analysis, remember, we saw levels of analysis. You've got the international system, domestic politics, and individual politics. So just some of the different causes of war that can exist on both sides, right? So we could have personnel at each level. So we could have personality, right? So it could be something in a particular leader's personality makes them more conflict prone. So there are different personality traits that would be, have a greater need to either respond to a slight, so that could enhance conflict between different sides, or who is more believing in the usefulness of military force. There's a variety of different kind of personality, kind of like traits that are fixed, but also we could add in kind of values as well, values learned or acquired values that could influence kind of the propensity for going to war. So you may have certain leaders, the likelihood of a war can be affected by which leader is in charge. Some leaders may be more war prone than others. At the individual level, wars can occur because of misperceptions. So for example, in World War I, one of the major sources of war was the belief by both sides that the offense had the advantage. So if you attacked, you'd have the advantage. It'd be a relatively quick war. There was always a statement, oh, we'll be home by Christmas at the start. There's a complete misperception that with the military technology that existed, it was actually a defensive advantage, right? For some strange reason, military leaders believed that running at, despite the technologies that included things like trenches and machine guns, running at this could overcome those weaponries, just sending troops at defensive positions manned by trenches and with troops in trenches with machine guns and weapons running across an open field somehow was still an offensive advantage. How they misperceived this, there's entire literature on that. But there was a clear misunderstanding of what type of war we're going to be fighting. And hopefully, if they had understood how brutal World War I was going to be, maybe different decisions would have been made. And then biases. We've already talked about how some of the rules of thumb can lead to biased decision making. So, for example, the fundamental attribution error, right? If you misperceive the reasons for someone doing something, right? Every time something negative happens, we use the example of shooting down a plane. Rather than looking at kind of the situation, you think it's because of some dispositional characteristic of the other side. So they're aggressive, right? So if you're continually viewing and having these kind of negative perceptions of the other side in terms of who they are, this can lead into war. And that's just one of many different biases that you can have. And all of them can produce kind of errors, systematic errors. And some of these errors can make war more likely. At the domestic level, so looking within the state. So there's been research on whether national attributes, so things like political culture, are certain political cultures more war prone than others? Are certain ideologies more war prone than others? Are certain religions more war prone than others? So there's been research at looking at all of these different things and how they can produce war. There's research on nationalism, right? So attachment to your state, so kind of which not only national attachment to your state and kind of patriotism, so strong identification with your state, it also can come with also kind of a strong love of your in-group, can also come with a dislike of the out-group of others, a feeling of if nationalism in and of itself, or patriotism, kind of, which would be a step below, there's nothing inherently wrong. Where nationalism starts becoming a problem is if it shifts too much from being just a, we love our group, which there's nothing wrong with loving your group, but if that gets transformed into a kind of a form of we're better than other groups, kind of a hyper-nationalism where not only are we great, but those others are inferior to us, that can lead to war as well. Diversionary wars. So in diversionary wars, we're looking at situations where, say, a domestic leader is facing trouble, is facing problems, and so they try to distract from those domestic problems, say domestic economic problems or corruption, whatever it may be, by initiating a war with the other side, knowing that people are more likely to support the government. We talked about this a little bit already. They're more likely to support the government when a war has been started, right? So they use the war to distract from the domestic problems and rally the population behind the government, because you should be supporting, or many people feel like you should be supporting your government join a war. So get greater support, get attention off the domestic problems, and get them onto kind of the war that will rally public opinion to your side. And then log rolling can be where you have a whole bunch of different domestic groups who don't necessarily all individually favor war, but when they bring their different interests together, so kind of it could be in form of different concessions to one. So one side says, I need you to support me on this, and in return, I'll support you on this. And when all of these different interests come together, you can have some actors who don't really actually support war, but because of concessions they have to give to other groups who do support war, it all ends up kind of gaining momentum, and you end up having kind of an outcome at the aggregate that nobody actually really individually was looking for, but but it's kind of a little bit of element of something that everybody wanted, and you end up with this monster kind of policy at the end. And if some of the groups involved in log rolling were supporting actions that make war more likely, it could, or who even favor war directly, it could lead to a wide range of society or societal actors or interest groups supporting war. Then causes of war at the systemic level. So we've already talked a little bit about balance of power. There's kind of opposing theories, both within kind of more or less the realist camp, on whether balance of power leads to stability or instability. So in the balance of power, war is more likely when there's an imbalance of power. So when there's a balance of power, nobody's certain that they could win. They can, nobody is likely to be able to go push towards hegemony. So there's no reason to fight. If there's an imbalance of power, where the stronger side can use its greater advantage to coerce the other side, the smaller side wants to try to weaken the stronger one. But in particular, the stronger side can use its advantage in power to do whatever to do what it wants. So that's why there's a favoring of balance, because if there's balance, then if one side tries to do something against you, you're able to push back, and so and vice versa. So nobody's able to kind of exploit the other side. The flip side, power transition theory, says that war is more likely when there is a balance of power. And this argument goes more or less that when there's a great imbalance in power, the stronger side essentially gets to set the rules of the game. So it doesn't even really need to use its military power to fight other sides. It essentially gets to set the rules of the game. And nobody's strong enough, or none of the surrounding states, or if it's a global, none of the great powers are able to challenge it. What happens so when that side, the stronger side, starts either declining or another party starts rising, as they get closer and closer to power, war becomes more likely in the power transition theory, because either the stronger state, the declining state, starts a war knowing that this is its only opportunity. So it's kind of a preventive war, saying if we don't start the war now, the other side will be able to overtake us and either defeat us in war or just change the rules of the game, and we won't be in a position to challenge it. So the declining state might start it, or at a certain point, the rising state may start the war, trying to exploit its new, especially if it's just past the stronger state, can try to kind of consolidate its position now that it's in the position to be able to contend and change the rules of the game. So there's arguments that the first couple of First and Second World War had elements of Germany was rising, the UK was falling. So before the World Wars, the UK would have been the strongest power in the world. Germany was gradually rising in power, and so some of it was kind of a hegemonic war over who controlled the international system between the two different sides. And Germany had to wait to be able to challenge until it was in a strong enough position to be able to challenge the UK. when it was too weak, there's no point in starting a war where it would have just starting a war with one that it clearly it very, very likely would have lost, and it would have set back its growth um, based on the punishment and based on losing resources from losing. Now, what type, we've talked about, there's many, many different types of conflicts that you can have, right? And very, very few of them escalate to war. So are there some that are more likely, certain types of conflicts, certain type of disputes that are more likely to escalate to war? And there's two types that in particular seem to be more war prone. So conflicts over territory and protracted conflicts. So we'll look a little bit at both of those. So what are territorial disputes? So territorial disputes are dyadic or wired, more war prone. So dyadic territorial disputes have a higher probability of escalating to war than general foreign policy disputes or disputes over the nature of one side's regime. So compared to other types of conflict, conflicts or disputes over territory. So dyadic meaning a pair. So if you have so pair states fighting over or having a dispute over a particular bit of territory. So France and Germany disagreeing over who should be controlling Alsace-Lorraine, something of that sort. These type of conflicts or disputes are more likely to escalate to war than, say, a disagreement over proper form of government or any other foreign policy type of disputes. There's a particular set of territorial disputes that are particularly problematic in resolving. And this should give you a little bit of a hint as to what it is here with a picture of Jerusalem. And these are territorial conflicts over sacred spaces. Part of why they are more likely or could be more likely to escalate is that they're just so difficult to resolve. So what are sacred spaces to start? So the religious centers at which heavenly and earthly meet, a means of access between the human and divine world. So we're not just talking about like your run-of-the-mill church or mosque or synagogue, right? We're talking about sacred spaces, so places of centrality within the religion, where oftentimes it's a location where an important event happened within the religion, but it also could be a place of just, like the central church for an entire religion, right? So you could have, like within Christianity, it could be particular sites where Jesus is believed to have been, right? So many of those could be sacred spaces, but also could be somewhere for Catholics. It could be, the Vatican. There's nothing of particular religious significance that necessarily happened at the Vatican from like, say, God or Jesus appearing, but it is a place of significance for Catholics, not for other Christians necessarily, but for Roman Catholics, it would be a place of great religious significance, and a meeting with the Pope having direct access, or kind of being the intermediary between, God and Catholics. That would be, that would have kind of a divine significance. So it would be a place of a religious center where the heavenly and the earthly meet. So why are sacred spaces so difficult to resolve conflicts over? And at core, besides their just sheer importance, is the issue of indivisibility. So all sacred spaces fulfill the conditions for indivisibility. Sacred spaces are coherent monolithic spaces that cannot be subdivided. They have clearly defined and inflexible boundaries, and they are unique sites for which no material or spiritual substitute is available, right? So this place, something clearly important happened, and you can't pick up and move this space. We can't say, again, going with the Christianity example, right? So there's a space where Jesus is believed to have been born, right? And there's an important church there. We can't just say, oh, well, Jesus was, we're going to change, or we're just going to pick up and move that spot. We're just going to move like there's even kind of like a circle on the ground where you place your hand or something. If you visit, we're going to just pick that up and move it somewhere else. And now we're just going to say Jesus was born somewhere else. Now, maybe they're wrong about where Jesus was born if you believe Jesus was born there. It's possible they're wrong, but the belief within the religion is this is the spot. And so you can't change it, and you can't just say, oh, well, the boundaries are changed, right? Like it wasn't here, or we'll give up half the space variable. Same thing, there's a space where Jesus was believed to have died, right? And so there's a church built around there, and this is a place of centrality within Christianity, right? You can't just pick it up and move it, or say this place is no longer of importance to us. And the problem with indivisibility is a major way that you could solve conflicts, including many territorial ones, is saying, let's negotiate and we will give you, we'll find some way that we could subdivide the territory. Or we're not going to subdivide the territory, but we'll give you this instead. And you can negotiate something. But in this case, sacred spaces aren't divisible. So you can't just give up part of it, because the entirety is of significance to the religion. But there's also nothing because of its sacredness. It's not like you can even say, okay, we'll give you all of this in return for this. There's nothing in return that's likely to be good enough that they'll say, we'll sacrifice this in return for this other thing. So while all territorial disputes are the most likely to escalate the war and are very difficult to resolve, the ones over sacred spaces are, even among territorial disputes, so the most difficult to deal with. The second set of conflicts that are most likely to escalate to war are what are referred to as protracted conflicts, or a PC for short. So for a conflict to qualify as a protracted conflict, there must be at least 3 international crises between the same pair of adversaries over one or more recurring issues during a period of at least 5 years. So similar to war, there's a little bit of arbitrariness in whether it's like 3 international conflicts over, at least 5 years, or, is it 2, is it 4, is it 5, is it 7 years, is it 3? There's a little bit of arbitrariness here, but the basic idea is it's pairs of states or groups of states, often pairs, that have just recurring, the conflict lasts long enough, but not just does the conflict last a long time, but it escalates, not necessarily even to war, but to at least international crises sufficiently frequently. So these are conflicts that aren't getting resolved, and if anything are having flare-up periods frequently enough. So at least 3 international crises during a period of at least 5 years. So it can't just be, if you have 3 in rapid succession within a year, that's just, a really bad dispute. But this is something over at least 5 years. So it's long lasting, and it's getting to a certain level of hostility frequently enough. And if we look at it, if we look at the evidence, so conservatively about 0.2 of dyads, so 0.2% of pairs of states account for about 20% of crises. So if we're looking at the number of crises that we have, it's really it's a very, very small percentage of dyads of states that are actually involved in international crises. 1% of dyads are responsible for 60% of 20th century crises. So the vast majority are only from small pairings of states. It's just that these small pairing of states have repeated crises between them. And 92 strategic rivalries account for 67% of crises. So over about 2/3 of crises are from just certain pairings. So most pairings, most states, most of the time, don't have any problems with each other. What we see is that crises tend to be the same groups of states, the same pairings of states that have repeated issues with each other, repeated escalations into crises, often repeated wars with each other, and so those are the problem ones. So most, there's a whole bunch of conflicts that occur between different states. Most states don't even have conflicts with each other. Most dyads don't even have conflicts. But even within the dyads that have conflicts, most of them, it's kind of one shot. They never escalate up to an international crisis. It's certain pairings for a variety of different reasons that have a disproportionate weight. So protracted conflicts are the ones that are particularly likely. If you want to be predicting which conflicts are likely to escalate to further international crises or wars, you'd want to be looking at what are the protracted conflicts that exist now, and those are particularly ones that there's a high likelihood that you'd be guessing accurately. So that's it for today. Next time, we will be continuing at looking at different types of conflict.